Well, I would like to posit to you today that religious freedom is the issue of our day. Now, you can't turn on the news, no matter where you live in the world, without seeing another humanitarian crisis, a famine, a refugee crisis, or an act of terrorism. And many of these acts are rooted in religious bigotry, intolerance, and conflict. The reality is that right now, about 79% of the world's population live in countries that severely repress our religious freedom. 10 years ago, that number was 68%. So in the past decade, in the last two Congresses, that number has increased significantly. And I'd like for you to consider what that number will be in the next 5 years, and in the next 10 years, and longer. You see, the reality is that we are here today because we understand the value of religious freedom. But most people in the world live in countries where religious freedom is a foreign concept to them. They don't understand it and they don't value it. And unless we begin to teach them to value this freedom, it will be erased for everyone. And that's something that I don't think anyone here would want. If you look around the world today, the humanitarian and military solutions that have been tried have not worked. They cannot and have not, on their own, establish peace. So I ask you a question. What can stop the cycle of violence and hate rooted in religious bigotry, intolerance, and conflict around the world today? The answer might surprise you. The organization that I run is called Hardwired. It's called Hardwired because we believe every human being was made to worship, was made for the freedom to worship something bigger than ourselves, and that they deserve the freedom to do that. And that's what we work to defend around the world for people of all faiths and none. Hardwired has two goals. We provide education and training to leaders in countries where we can establish teams that will defend religious freedom, and we also plant the seeds of freedom through education. Now, the reason that we work in these two different fields is because you need a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach to really get at the root causes of religious intolerance in the world today and build societies for peace. A few months ago, I was with a group of teachers that we were working with from different countries in the Middle East and North Africa. One of the teachers over lunch shared a story with me that I want to share with you, because I think it symbolizes the problem in front of us today. This teacher was in Erbil, Kurdistan, Iraq, which if you've been to Iraq, you know it's one of the safe havens for people that have fled from ISIS. She was teaching a group of students that were not refugees. But these students, she found on the playground playing a very unusual game. It was a game where they were beheading another student like ISIS. They were pretending that they were ISIS. If that terrifies you, I can assure you that it terrified the teacher even more. She didn't know how to respond. And the reality is, when I talk to teachers and government leaders across the Middle East and North Africa, they don't know how to respond to this kind of situation. But their children, whether they like it or not, are being influenced by the ideas of ISIS, because children associate with the group that's in power, and right now, that's the group that seems to be winning. So what do we do as 600,000 children are liberated from Mosul and from ISIS, and another 1.8 million children live in Kurdistan that are possibly identifying with ISIS in the same way? Do we allow this cycle of violence to continue for another generation? Do we wait until we have another conflict in Syria, a humanitarian and refugee disaster in the world? Or do we find a way to get at the root cause of this challenge? In the past 3 years, Hardwired has established agreements with 3 countries in the Middle East and North Africa. I'll just mention one of them, which is the Kurdish government in northern Iraq, and the other 2 I'll keep. But if you want to ask me privately, you can. Now, this is the first time in the history of the Middle East, and really for any country in the world that I'm aware of, that they've established an agreement to begin teaching about religious freedom in their public schools. Now, for a region that is the most hostile of any region in the world to religious freedom, it is absolutely astounding that they would allow us to come in and teach their children to value religious freedom. Why in the world would they do that? Well, they recognize that they have a major problem on their hands. They recognize that terrorism has taken such root in the hearts and minds of their children that they're losing them to terrorism and extremism. And it's destabilizing their own control of power. So unless something is done, there is no future for the region. So governments, monarchies, dictators across the region are beginning to look for ways to penetrate the younger generations and turn them away from extremism. So how do they build resiliency against the ideas of intolerance and hate in their children? It begins in a classroom, and it begins by planting the seeds of freedom that teach children to value the rights and freedoms of others. This is a delicate, a dangerous, and a very sensitive process that touches a very deep nerve. And I can assure you that it does not occur without a lot of tension in the room when we begin. But it's essential. Let me share a story with you that's also, I should note, in the Liberty Journal that Lincoln Steed oversees and was published last year. It's called A Peaceful Garden. When we first started working in Iraq, 2 teachers that had fled from ISIS, who were Yazidis, went through the program and designed a lesson to teach children in the refugee camps. This lesson they worked on with a Baha'i, a Jew, an imam, an atheist, a Sikh, and a Christian. So out of this really odd group of people from a diverse group of faiths, they came up with something called the Peaceful Garden. And this is what is going to transform the hearts and minds of children and break the cycle of hate and intolerance in the Middle East. These 2 gentlemen took their students to a garden. The garden was beautiful. They asked their students to go and to make themselves a bouquet of flowers. But they said, choose any color except for this one color. So the students went, they made their bouquets, they took all the flowers they could except for the one color, and they came back. And the teacher said, now I want you to look back at the garden and see what's happened. And the students looked, and they realized that they had destroyed the garden. It wasn't the same. And the teacher said, this is the same thing that's happened in our country, in Iraq, because of ISIS. They've destroyed everyone except for the people that look like them. And they said to the students, do you want to help us change this, or do you want to live like this? And they said, no, we want to change it. What do we do? So the teachers gave each student a packet of seeds and partnered them with a person from a different religion. And the students had to replant the garden, and over a series of months, they worked together to learn about one another and about the value of religious freedom. And in the end, they came back to the garden and they looked, and it was beautiful. And the teacher said, what does it take to rebuild this garden? And they said, it's a lot of work. But we recognize now that if we don't plant the seeds of freedom together, if we don't learn how to get along, how to value the dignity and humanity of one another, regardless of what we believe and whether we agree with one another or not, if we can't overcome our fears, our misconceptions, of one another, we will never rebuild our country. And the teacher said, do you want to rebuild your country, or do you want to keep living like this in fear of one another? And they said, no, we want to change. And so the teacher said, then we're going to work together. And the Kurdish government was so moved by that they said, Tina, we want to share this curriculum. And I'll just show you this peaceful garden, and I'll leave it with Kanun. We want to share this booklet and this lesson with every child in Iraq and with all of the children that are being liberated from ISIS in Mosul, because we know that if we can't instill in them the value of religious freedom, we will never overcome this cycle of hate that exists in our country. We will never be free. Let me share another story of somebody who went through our training. It was a judge, a Muslim judge, from an area controlled by ISIS. After going through the training, he was really moved, and he was always an advocate for human rights, but he learned how much more he needed to stand in defense of persecuted communities like the Yazidis and the Christians. And he said, Tina, I'm going to defend this, and he went and he met with the communities. A couple months later, he came back to our training, and we asked him how things were going, and he showed us an image on his phone. And the image was of ISIS beheading his youngest brother. And it was a warning. It was a warning because he had dared to stand up in the courts for the justice of the victims of terrorism, for Christians and Yazidis and other persecuted communities. And I said, will you continue? And he said, Tina, if I don't stand up, if I don't continue, this is the fate that awaits everyone in Iraq. You see, these teachers, these children, these judges, they're Christian, they're Muslim, they're Yazidi, they're Mandaean. We work with people all over the world, and they're from a lot of different religious backgrounds and none. And they recognize that if we don't tend the delicate seed of religious freedom, no one will ever have the dignity that they deserve, that God created them to have. So how can we break the cycle of violence and hate? How can we establish peace in the world today? The answer that I give to you is religious freedom. It is the only basis that will sustain a moral conscience of humanity that values the dignity and freedom of others. We cannot do it on our own. We have to find a way of transforming the way people see each other in societies where religious freedom is a foreign concept. And that is difficult work. But just like those children that planted those seeds in a garden, it is essential. I know that it's easy to come and to hear a lot of topics about something, and you wonder in the end, what can I do? I'm a very practical person. I don't like to just talk, I like to do something. So I want to leave you with something to do today as well. The reality is that you are the strongest voice for religious freedom in the world today. They need you. Your countries need you, just like Dr. Graz shared. Those children need you. Those refugees need you. And we cannot afford for your voice to be silenced. So I challenge you today to go to our website, hardwiredglobal.org. There's a journey for freedom. I encourage you to take it. Take it with your children. Take it with your church. Take it with your community. Or look at all the other ways that we have on there. Take the peaceful garden lesson and do it in your own community. But begin to plant the seeds of freedom today where you are, or they will not be here in another decade. Thank you.